Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thanks, Jonathan and Johar, for having me here. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So I'll begin with a disclaimer. I'm not a demonologist by training, and as mentioned in the introduction, I happen to have written a book, broadly speaking, on travel and mobility. So I'm going to speak on travel and mobility. And my intervention in today's context is like from a post-colonial vantage point. So I'm going to talk about this guy who you see here. He is Bholanauth Chunder, the name appears here, and probing the Asura is like the word for demon in some of the Indian languages, including the one that I speak. So I'm going to not going to bore you with like biographic details of this guy, which you can anyway pull out from the internet. I'm more interested in like he's a 19th century guy, of course, and then he records his travelogues, like his diary entries, which he later publishes in the 1960s, 1970s, and a series of travel accounts, which was published as this. Oh, sorry. How do you the
next slide? Just
like do I use the mouse and or is there a shortcut?
Yeah.
Work. I think I pressed it a little bit in here. Yeah. So yeah, so this is the book that he published his travel. So it's a 2-volume work that's a recorded archive of his travelogues. So I'll also I'm really sorry. I want to go back.
Just click the left one.
And how do you go back?
This button and this little arrow here.
Oh, okay. So I have to go back and forth between. Okay, so maybe I have to reposition this.
Okay, good.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. I'm sorry about the glitches. Yeah, so I think I have to reposition this. Yeah, that is better. So yeah, so this is a 2-volume work, and I'm going to speak about this. I'm not, as I said, I'm not interested in the biographic stuff. I'm going to speak about the heuristics of the concept Asura, which is emerging in the 19th century for reasons because of colonialism and the kind of traveling gestures and the traveling infrastructures that were emerging in the 19th century. So I am making a provisional distinction here between the travelogue as a European literary genre of expression and travel narratives. I mean, this is only provisional for the sake of better understanding. So I'm making this dichotomy, although I'm well aware that it's very problematic for a number of reasons, including like how taxonomies could be taxonomies and categorizations after post-structuralists, the Foucault and Ian hacking and all of that can be very problematic. So I'm well aware of that, but having said that, I'm also making this provisional dichotomy just to be able to better make sense of the kind of heuristics and the conceptual vocabulary from where this guy is working on. So I already showed you like this is his book here. So so this is the generic elements. I mean, the rationale for travel and the reason for recording. I mean, it kind of differed, and like I'm aware that distinguishing between travel narrative and travelogue is problematic, as I said. But yeah, so by contrast, Bholanauth Chunder's travelogue used elements, and this is like the point that I want to make right at the beginning. Like he was, unlike many of his compatriots, he was first and foremost traveling within India, as opposed to some of his compatriots in the 19th century who were like enchanted by the idea of West and also the opening of the Suez Canal and all of that. yeah. So, I mean, they were enchanted by the West, and his fellow compatriots were mostly traveling to the West. Unlike this guy who never stepped out of India, he traveled within India extensively. And he was very interested, as I said, in keeping his diary records. And he was using certain narrative styles, including uh, folk tales, local myths, and anecdotes, which would kind of overlap with the European technique, the stylistic technique of travelogue. So, in other words, I'm trying to draw your attention to the overlap between these two stylistic elements of a very indigenous, traditional way of keeping travel records, contra the European standards of writing a travelogue. Yeah. So the travelogue as a genre was thus configured within the coordinates of a cultural science system based on the dialectic of the self and other, which is a trope that he is borrowing in his writing. But having said that, at the same time, he's very keen intent on reinscribing his ethnic position as like a number of ethnic positions, including he called himself Babu Bholanauth Chunder. Babu is as a honorific title that was conferred by the British, number one. He was number two, a Hindu. So he kind of pitting against his identity against, like in the context of Islamophobia that Jonathan has mentioned right in the morning. So there's element of Islamophobia here. So he's pitting his Hindu identity against the Muslim other. And then also, as we are going to move through the slides, you will see that there are these indigenous people who he's referring to as Asura slash demon. So what I'm trying to argue here is like demon becomes like a point of reference, a referent for the anthropomorphic other and certain ethnic communities that he, as a Babu Hindu, has issues with. So with that, I'll get on to yeah. So in his writing, Chunder referred to himself as a member of the Young Bengal, which is a kind of like a very Western elite organization. Also, like they had a certain Hindu revivalist agenda. So I'm not getting into that. So a group associated mainly with like the revivalist idea and stuff like that. So the supposed modernity espoused by various members of this group and their emphasis on rationalism and their criticism of Hindu religious practices in the 1830s and 40s informed the revivalist undercurrent in Chandra's perception of being a Hindu. So that's the underlying agenda here. Like he has to reassert himself as a Hindu in a number of different ways. So in 1869, he publishes this, as I said, and Christopher Bailey, Christopher Bailey has this book on Indian intelligence system, where he makes a point about how these travelogues were also doubling as surveys. These were not plain literary texts, but these were also surveys. And when I say survey, I invoke Barnard Cohen's forms of colonial forms of knowledge here, because I mean the survey, the map, the cartography, demographic statistics, and so on and so forth. These were also new techniques and colonial ways of knowing the world, using different conceptual categories and very different heuristics. So he was also like when he was writing this, he was also in a way furnishing a certain kind of survey. So my talk uses Chandra's travelogue as a case study to illustrate how the relationship between the traveler and the traveled was mediated by heuristic categories, like of which I'm going to speak of the demand or the Asura. So that's the heuristic category that is emerging of a particular kind of traveling that he is undertaking, of like emerging out of Western imperialist templates, and how Chandra's purportedly Hindu gaze fostered communal ethos at a time when cultural histories were being rewritten, and there were issues of this process of political partisanship, struggles of meaning of nation, and of course the issues of colonialism and so on and so forth. So thinking in these terms, the conceptual category Hindu was also being crystallized at that point of time. So I mean, That's the whole. Let me share this anecdote with you. I mean, before the 19th century, it was not uncommon in Indian families to raise one child as Hindu and the other one as Sikh or Jain or Buddhism. I mean, not of the Abrahamic faith, but I mean, it was very natural, and like especially in northwestern India, it was common to raise your one child as like as Hindu and the other one as Buddhist or Jain. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is in the 19th century, there was also this business of having to crystallize and clearly demarcate the borders of Hinduism, Muslim, and so on and so forth. So a number of religions, and like Bernard Cohen has written extensively on this, how these new forms of knowledge, including statistical surveys and cartographies and census and so on and so forth, would have profound influence on how people tried to imagine the contours of Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, so I'll now jump onto his travelogue, and this is where the Islamophobic stuff comes into the picture, and this is what he says about the. I'm not going to read out the quotes aloud. So this is what he has to say about the Muslims. And like it's of course, yeah, I mean, you see the racist tinge to it. I mean, it's totally conceivable that, I mean, this comes at a time when the Hindu identity also crystallizes. And so this is point number one that I wanted to make. And there are other traces. For the interest of time, I'm not going into details. I mean, there are certain sections where he compares the Muslim with demons and so on and so forth. But the more interesting stuff I'll get into here is this. Yeah, the ethnic community, the Santhal, like it's like an ethnic community. They even the north and western part of India, usually imagined, of course, in Bholanauth Chunder's imagination, as a backward and underdeveloped people, and so on and so forth. And these are the kind of very discursive trope that Chunder uses across his literary oeuvre. So when Chunder foregrounded his niche Hindu identity over his Indian identity, and that's the point that I have been trying to make, like as an Indian, he was more interested in traveling within India, because he was also intent on reasserting his Hindu identity to a great extent. He was developing and proliferating the prototype of Hindu traveler. That's what I call the Hindu gaze. So as a category, its historical, cultural, and political specificity was imbricated in the discourse of Hindu nationalism. The point, therefore, is to situate the category Hindu in its history and context. And with respect to Chander's travelogue, revisits his manifold accounts as a disempowered colonial subject. The Hindu traveler, as a Hindu traveler, Chunder desperately attempted to become a compatriot of the colonizer, and that comes across in the description, the ethnic description of the Santhal and a number of other communities he describes as the anthropomorphic other. So the Hindu traveler thereby acquired peculiar ways of seeing, and this is a phrase, of course, I'm borrowing John Berger's phrase here, akin to what the 18th century cultures of visuality, Peter Dibola has this evocative expression, what he calls the education of the eye. So Peter Dibola has this book called Education of the Eye, where he talks about how the European grand tourist was trained to undertake certain kind of tourism and traveling practices that was essentially got to do with a certain ocular training. So you go to the museums, not to other places. So because that is supposed to train you in ocularly in a certain, that's a certain aesthetic apprenticeship to begin with. So that's what Peter Dibola calls the education of the eye. And if you go through Chander's travelogue, how 5 minutes, yeah. So if you go through Chander's travelogue, the metaphor or the epithet of visuality, the ocular aesthetic, and so on, is the travelogue is replete with such metaphors and so on. and so forth. So, yeah, so this is what he says. The Santhal is a curious specimen of the human species, and of course, like the curiosity like has a certain kind of this very surveyistic ways of looking into the world. Yeah, so what you see here is the Santhal as a like an ethnographic community is being compared to the demons, and he says that he's a descendant of the cognate branch of those who are styled in Dasyas, afterwards the Asuras of the Purans. So what I find interesting here, and I'll probably try to wind up, is the fact that look at the neologism here, and some of these have already been discussed to morning, like the Asura or the demon is not necessarily ununivocally good or bad, because these qualities often converge and overlap. So I'll take the liberty of borrowing some of the stuff that already been discussed to morning. And these are some of the classical Indic sources where you find the Asura in the Rig Veda has been equated with, the supreme godheads, and the Mitra and Varuna in the Vedic tradition being, the top of the pantheon, and so on and so forth. And they were classified Rig Veda. So the Asura, if you look into the etymology, the terminology itself, I mean, they were not necessarily bad to begin with. And in the Rig Veda, and if you find the total number of hymns dedicated to these godheads, Mitra and Varuna, they were like outstanding large number. So you can guess the importance from the number of hymns being dedicated to them. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is, like in the classical or the classical slash traditional or slash Indic thought, the idea of the demon was not necessarily bad, and then it was kind of undergoing a certain transformation, heuristically speaking, in the colonial, post-colonial slash post-colonial times. And you see the neologism here, and from where Chunder picks up this concept of the Asura, which kind of acquires a certain kind of value system, which was mediated by the Western imperialist lens. So this is a quote from Ramila Thapar, ancient history, who works on ancient history, and this is what I'll end probably with this quote. And she talks about, look, the Buddhist monk, for example, in the later period was frequently addressed as a area, like Arya, which was an honorific, even though Buddhists didn't have any means to accept the teaching of the Rig Vedas. In Ramayana, Ravana, who was depicted as a demon, is addressed by his wife as Aryaputra, literally the son of Arya. So what Thapar draws our attention to here is the fact that, I mean, again, the overlap between the Aryanism, yeah, I'm done. Aryanism and demonism, so to say. And if you go back to Chunder here, he sets up this dichotomy here between the Arya and the Demona. So these are like two categories. Again, like as I said, like I'm more interested in the categorical imperatives and how the contours and the boundaries were solidifying at that point of time, as opposed to, if you go here, you will see like the distinctions were very amorphous, and like people didn't care about the boundaries that were yet to crystallize in the 19th century through discourses like travelogues and other similar ways of seeing the world around you. So I'll stop here and I'll be happy to answer questions and comments.